Hello everyone, this is Sherry from Sharecroppers, and hopefully this week will go a little bit better with our connection. The weather's a lot better here today. It's very cold, but at least it's sunny, and I don't think we'll have any connection problems today. We'll wait a minute for everyone to jump in. Good morning, Gail. So this is our Peaceful Deer online card class. It's the second in our free online card classes, and we're going to be making these 3 cards today using the Peaceful Deer bundle. So this is the Peaceful Deer stamp set, and there's a coordinating deer punch. And I'm just going to move my computer so that I can see it a little bit better. It's much easier for me to see your comments when I'm using my computer to watch as well, instead of trying to watch them on my phone. So I'll just move that a little bit closer here. And I'm also in a different room today. Hi, Debbie. Hi, Carol. I am actually in the larger classroom here at the studio. I've been doing my videos and my lives from my office, but the lighting has been a little wonky in there lately. So this seems to be pretty good lighting. Let me know if there are shadows that interfere. But like I said, I can see it here on my laptop and it looks really good. So I hope that you all have your Peaceful Deer bundle if you're going to be stamping along with me. If you don't have this bundle, but you're using a different one, if you're substituting, you could really substitute anything that has the deer in it. I also used the little bunny from the set, but you could put a deer in there instead. Or maybe you're using a completely different bundle altogether and you're just using the layouts, because these layouts can go for any design. They do not have to be Christmas cards or deer cards. You could really do anything with them. So we're making 3 different holiday cards, and each one has a different layout and each one uses different stamps so that you can try to use as many from your stamp sets as possible. I like to have a variety. I'm going to move these out of the way and we'll talk about the supplies that you're going to need if you're stamping along with me today. I'll leave the first card that we're going to be creating right here. So with this one, we are going to be stamping our deer and punching it out. So you'll need some scraps for that. Whenever I include scraps in an online class, I always notch the corner there so that you know that that is not a layer. So if you ever purchase an online class or bingo from me and you find a notched piece of cardstock, it means that that's the scrap. So that's kind of a little hint for you. All right, so we're going to need a garden green card base. This is just a regular A2 card base, 5.5 by 8.5, scored in the middle at 4 1/4. The DSP layers that you're going to need, there's just 4 little strips. So this is a great way to use up some of those little scraps that you might have. It doesn't take a lot. It takes 4 pieces that are each 1 inch wide. So when you are cutting your layers for your cards, I often do the love it, chop it, where it's 4 inches by 5 1/4. And that will leave you with a 1 inch strip. So this is a great way to use up some of those 1 inch strips that you might have. So these are, you're going to need 2 of the longer pieces that are each 1 inch wide by, let me see my little cheat sheet here. I think, well, it'll be quicker just to measure it. I think it's 4 1/4. Yes. So they're 1 inch wide by 4 1/4, and you'll need 2 of those. And then the smaller pieces are 1 by 3. So 2 of those. The layers that go in the middle, you're going to need a piece of basic white and a piece of contrasting color. I'm using real red. You could use whatever you pull from your designer paper colors. So the small strip here, this small piece of white is 1 3/4 wide by 3 inches long. And the mat is 1 7/8 inches wide by 3 1/8 long. So that will be a perfect mat. And that will fit right in the middle there. We're popping it up with dimensionals. Like I said, you're going to need some scraps of basic white. You want to make sure that it is a big enough scrap that you can stamp the deer and also be able to insert it down into your punch and have a little bit of a handle at the top or at the side to hold on to. The other scrap that I have here is for the antlers. I haven't stamped those yet, but I'm going to show you a little trick for stamping and punching the antlers because they're not, whoever designed the punch did not design it with a stamper in mind. I think they were just trying to fit everything into this circle, but the stamp for the antlers is together, so you get both of them. But the punch is not lined up. So I'm going to show you a little trick for punching that out. Now you can use whatever you would like to color your deer. I am using Stampin' Blends. I'm using the Crumb Cake combo, so it's light and dark. And I'm also going to use a little bit of light petal pink just for the inside of his ears. And I use that for all of the critters that are on today's projects. This is probably one of my most used combos, is the light and dark petal pink combo. I use it for all of my little people faces. I use it for lots of critters. It's perfect for rosy cheeks and the little pinks on the inside of ears. So let's go ahead and get started with our card assembly and stamping. We're going to assemble the card base first. So I'll move some of these pieces out of the way. I'll leave our sample right up there. So the way these are arranged, we're going to kind of make a little border or a frame around the outside of our card. And actually, this is called a framed panel card. Now, I saw my friend Megan do this on one of her lives, and I didn't get a chance to watch the live, but I thought, you know, I have not made one of those cards ever. So I've been playing around with some different designs with them, some different pattern papers, and thought that this would be a nice one for our deer class. Now, if you have an orientation for your paper, this might be a little tricky. So you might want to choose a paper that doesn't have a specific orientation. But you can see that it makes a little frame around the edge there. You want to keep in mind that these lines need to be in line with each other. So the border should be an equal border around the edge of the card. I'm going to grab my liquid glue for that, but you can use whatever flat adhesive you like. If you choose to use liquid glue, make sure you're using just a narrow strip near the edges. You do not have to cover the entire back with adhesive when you're using liquid glue. I find that the problem that most people have with the liquid glue is that they just use too much. They either squeeze out too much all at once, or they coat the entire back, and you don't need adhesive in the middle of this strip. I think I'm going to turn it this way. This paper doesn't really have an orientation, but you might find that one way looks better than the other. Make sure you say hello if you are here. I see Jamie on, and Carol, and Gail, and Susan. How are you all? You all survived Thanksgiving and Black Friday and Cyber Monday. It was quite a week. So I have to apologize because my weekly Fun Fold Facebook Live did not happen this week. So it didn't happen on Wednesday because I had a terrible headache, and I could feel it coming on, and I just knew that I needed to postpone. So I postponed it to Thursday, which was yesterday. And I was here at the studio all day, and I was working on projects for tomorrow's craft fair. And I looked at the clock and it said 4:30. And the next time I looked at the clock, it was like after 9. It was crazy. I said, who loses 4 hours crafting? Probably all of us could lose 4 hours crafting. I was not sitting near the window to see even how late it was getting outside, like how dark it was getting. I was sitting here in the classroom, and over on the side that was not by the window and the door, so I had no idea how dark it had gotten so quickly. I did make some really cute projects though. Share a couple of those with you at the end of today's. Deb, yes, we all can lose that time. Okay, so this is probably the longest part of this card, is gluing these panels on and making sure that they're even. So you can see we have that really nice frame on there now. I'm going to set this part of the card aside now because we're going to work on our deer. I already stamped my deer on the scrap paper, and I used soft suede. Normally when I color with Stampin' Blends, I use the black Memento ink, but I didn't want the black outline. I wanted a softer look, and so I actually used soft suede for all of my deer today. So we've stamped her or him with soft suede, and now we're going to pull in our Stampin' Blends. I'm going to actually start with my petal pink and just do a little tiny bit inside his ears. And whenever I color with Stampin' Blends, I always use the bullet point. I find that I get way too much ink when I use the brush tip, so I use the bullet tip all the time. We're just gonna do a really small bit inside his ears. And that will blend a little bit once we add our crumb cake. So we're done with petal pink for this one. And now we'll start coloring. One of the tips that I can give you for coloring with Stampin' Blends is that it's almost like if you were watercoloring with a paintbrush, in that you want to make sure that you don't have any harsh edges where you've stopped coloring. So you want to make sure that there's always kind of a wet edge, if that makes sense. So I'm going to work from one side, and I'm going to keep working all around. And I use kind of small circles or little feathery strokes there. You don't want to let any of those edges dry because then it won't blend as well. This is a really small area right there, so it won't be as noticeable. But if I stopped coloring in the middle of his body and then went and did his legs, and then I came back and tried to blend the rest of the body in there, you might see a really distinct line, and we don't want that. So I'm going to try to keep going continuously, and we'll go over this with a second layer if we need to, but I'm just using small circular motions so that way I don't have any harsh lines. Trying not to go too close to the outside edges because I don't want it to bleed, and I also don't want it to bleed outside, and I don't want it to start to run the brown ink. So I'm going right up to the edge, and I'm not lingering near the edge either, because the longer you hold that marker in one spot, the more ink is going to flow out of the marker nib, and that will just start to saturate your paper. So now we'll go back here, and you might notice a little line there when it starts to dry because I did have that space that I let dry while I was coloring the rest of his body. We'll go over that though and try to blend that in just a minute after we do some shading. We're going to do some really basic shading on this guy today, but I'm coloring the entire deer first with crumb cake. If you don't feel comfortable shading, the deer is really cute just like this. We're going to add a little bit of shading in the video. So you can see that where the deer has like parts of the body, like the leg where it will overlap, or his head, that's where we're naturally going to add a little bit of shading. So I'm just going to kind of go in like that little circular motion, but before that dries, I'm going to come back in with my lighter color, and I'm going to go right over that and blend it in. Now, as it dries, it will blend more. And I'm just blending all the way down. Because I don't want those harsh lines. So I'm probably going to go right over his back leg again. That way I get a nice solid color. And I'm going to leave a little bit of his tail kind of lighter there. So now I'm going to come back in. I didn't color in this little crevice here on his chest because I'm going to shade in there with the darker one, and I didn't want too many layers of ink there all at once. Now I'll come back in with my lighter shade and just blend it in a bit. You can see as it dries, it will kind of have a mottled look to it, and that is what it looks like when it starts to blend, because you just have more layers of ink there. So we're going to have a little bit of shading there by his belly. And a little bit of shading here on the other side of his front leg. And your shading may look a little blotchy until it's fully dry, and then it will start to really blend in as all of the ink dries and the alcohol evaporates. I'm not going to shade on his face, but it is lighter because I've only colored his face, his head with one layer of ink. So I'm going to come in with a second layer just to make that a little bit more even. And then if you notice that there are any harsh shadows that you don't want there, you can blend those in. And then we'll let him dry. Just takes a minute for the alcohol inks to dry, and he'll be ready to punch. And remember that our punches are reversed so that you can line them right up and see exactly where you're punching. We're not going to keep those antlers. I'll just toss those because we're going to use a separate scrap for our antlers, and I'm going to show you that little trick for punching them in spite of them being poorly designed. Okay, so we're going to just set that aside with our card, and we will stamp our antlers on our scrap. So I have just a scrap of basic white. It doesn't have to be very wide. It just has to be wide enough to stamp both of those antlers. And you want to make sure that it's long enough that you would be able to insert it down into the punch. Now, when I punch them, I'm going to stamp it down here near the bottom, so that way the antlers are pointing up and we have all of this extra as a handle, okay? And we'll be inserting it into the punch at different angles. It will make more sense once I show you how we're doing that. If you came to my Peaceful Deer class, you probably know the little trick there. So now, instead of inserting it right into the punch, because if I did that, the antlers would not line up with the punch, I'm going to carefully snip in the middle of the antlers and snip all the way down my strip of cardstock. This way I have two images, two pieces that I can insert into the punch separately and have them line right up. Let's see, which one is this? Just stop and think. Okay, so this one right here, you can see they have to go in at kind of weird angles here, but we're going to punch that right there. Actually, I think I need to snip a little bit of this corner off. We want it to be able to line right up in there, and we can use a Post-it note too if we find that we need to reach in there. So there is one of our antlers perfectly punched, and I'll do the same thing with this one. This one's a little bit easier because it's near this side. I'll just snip off a little bit so that it will fit in our punch easily. There we go. So that's a way to stamp and punch out those antlers. Now, if you don't want to stamp and punch them, you could also just punch them from soft suede or early espresso cardstock and not have the stamped image at all. That would work as well. Now, the way the punches work is they leave a little bit of a white edge, but if we leave that white edge on there, no matter if we put the antler in front of the deer or behind him, there's going to be a white space in between his head and the antler, and that would look very strange. So we're going to snip off just a little bit here, so that way we don't have the white below the antler. See how now the stamped image goes right to the bottom? I'm going to do that with both of the antlers. So that way it will go right up against his head and there won't be a strange looking gap. And I'm going to add those with a glue dot. Now I'm just using the little glue dots that come in Paper Pumpkin or any of our kits because they're really nice and flat. And they're actually a lot flatter than the mini glue dots that you buy in the box. And it's perfect for this project. So what I've done is taken off the paper backing. I just used the tip of my scissors to get that off. You could use a take your pick tool. And I'm lining it right up with the bottom of the glue dot there. I don't want any exposed adhesive. And I'm going to slightly overlap them so that way it covers the entire glue dot. And then I can pull them off with the glue dot and attach it to the head of my deer. So it's going to grab just that little bit of white cardstock there. There, and we have our deer. So we'll set him aside, and now we'll be ready to stamp our sentiment. So we have our layer and our basic white. We're going to stamp the sentiment on basic white with real red ink. Just want to grab a little cushion to put under my stamping surface there because these are photopolymer stamps, so we want to make sure that we get a nice clear impression. So having a little cushion under there works well. I often just use the little cardboard that comes in Paper Pumpkin, and it's just the right amount of cushion for a lot of our photopolymer stamps. So if you have the Stampin' Pierce mat, that works great as well. But if you don't have one or it's not handy, the paper pumpkin cardboards work great. So we'll just ink up our sentiment, and we're going to put it down here near the bottom. Now, before we put this on our card, we're going to adhere it to the real red mat, and then we can pop it up with some dimensionals. We want to add some twine too. So if you want to add that little bit of like a detail, I guess, you can do that before we put it on our card front. I'm not seeing any comments here, so if you are commenting or asking questions, I can't see any. It's telling me who is watching, and the last thing I see is a comment from Debbie saying, I do, which I think is losing some time in the craft room. I think we all do that. But if you can say hi and let me know that my comments are working, that would be great. Or tell us if you're not using the Peaceful Deer bundle, or you're not using the painted Christmas DSP. Tell us in the comments what you are using. Give us some other ideas. I love that some of you shared your cards the other day in the group. Thank you, Debbie. Hi, I'm glad that I can see your comments now. I want you to share your cards, whether you use the same bundle and the same paper that I use, or you do something different. I want you to share them so that we can all see them. Okay, so I'm going to show you a little trick too for putting linen thread on. Linen thread is one of the trickiest ones to tie around a mat because it's very slippery and it's very small. So I cheat a little bit. Snickers is trying to help. Is Snickers a big help? Is he like stepping on your stamping surface? So I'm going to wrap a little bit of this around my mat. And instead of tying it, I'm going to use a dimensional because this is going to be popped up anyway on my card base. And I'm going to use a dimensional to hold my tail of my linen thread. Okay, and then I'll do the same thing up here, so that way it's holding it in place, but it will serve two functions. It's going to pop our panel up on our card front too, and then we'll snip the end. On the front, I'll make sure that that's even where I want it. And now to make my bow, I'm going to slide a separate piece underneath that thread and tie a small bow down by the sentiment. All this dry, cold winter air has dried my hands out so much. It's hard to pick up our cardstock and paper. Hard to really do anything when your hands are dry. I like to make this a very small bow, so we'll pull those tails a little bit and make the loop smaller. That's a good size. And snip our tails. Okay, now we can go ahead and add a few more dimensionals so that way it is popped right up on our card front. He just wants to help you with your holiday cards, Deb, adding his little paw of approval. This will be centered right here. And then we'll use a couple more dimensionals to pop our deer up. If you're mailing this and you're concerned about how thick your card is and you don't want to do 2 layers of dimensionals, you could always use tear and tape or any kind of flat adhesive to put this panel directly on your card base instead of popping it up. And now, ooh, I've got a little spot on there. Let's see if we can, I don't think we can cover that up. It's just a terrible spot. Let's see. Now he's going to extend off. You know what? I can actually angle him to cover that little spot up. That must have been a spot of soft suede ink. There. Still looks good, even though he's at a little bit different angle. So you can see now we have this card. I love having elements that extend beyond the linear layers. So to have something popped up on dimensionals and have it go beyond the layers in different directions, I love cards like that. So you can definitely mix up a linear card, but we have our first card done. Lana, I'm so glad that you're here. We'll set these aside and we'll move on to card number 2. Now we won't be using the punch for any more of these cards. We're actually using the other deer, the one that's laying down, and then the bunny on the last card. So we'll move on to our second card now. So this card has, like I said, the smaller deer. This one is the one that's laying down, and I didn't use any of the trees, just the snow, a sentiment, and some of the snowflakes. I'm pairing it with some of the pine cone prints. You can use whatever prints you would like. If you would like to have the same print on top and bottom, then you would just use one full panel of designer paper. I used 2 and they are the same size. So if you are using one piece of designer paper, then it would need to be, let me see here, 3.5 by 5, oh gosh, I've got to do 4 3/4. Trying to do the math here. But if you're using 2 separate pieces, it's 3.5 by 2 3/8, and you'll need 2 different prints. But like I said, you could do the same thing with one whole piece, or you could use an embossed piece of cardstock. You can substitute whatever you have or whatever you like. My card base is soft succulent, and it's just a regular A2 card base, just like we used for the first card. So it's 8.5 by 5.5, scored in the middle at 4 1/4. Now my layers, I'm using soft suede, and that one is 3 3/4 by 5. And the 2 pieces of designer series paper. Let me just make sure that my math was correct. So if you are using one piece of designer paper, it would need to be 3.5 by 4 3/4. But if you're using 2 like I did, they're 3.5 wide by 2 3/8 tall. So if your paper has an orientation, a direction, you'll want to keep that in mind as well when you're cutting these pieces. Now you're also going to need a contrasting color of cardstock for these 3 little strips. If you don't want the 3 little strips, you could just do one wider strip. That works too. But these are 1/4 inch wide and 4 1/8 long. So 1/4 inch by 4 1/8. And you'll need 3 of those. Now in the supply list, I said that you could use a label or a die cut circle, and you can see why here. I used this Label Me Lovely punch, and then I created my mat using the same punch, and I'll show you how I did that. You could use any label or any circle, just something that will go here that we can stamp our deer on. Finally, depending on what you have for a sentiment, you will need a circle. Mine is about, think it's about 1 3/8. So I use the layering circles dies, but if you have a 1.5 inch punch or the 1 3/8 punch that have retired, you could use those as well. I'm splitting my sentiment up. This is actually a really long Merry Christmas sentiment that's all in one line, but I'm splitting it up to fit on my circle. Okay. So let's set that aside, and we're going to do some stamping. So I have my label here, and I'm going to stamp the deer with soft suede. The snow will also be stamped with soft suede. So we'll center her. And now we'll use the snow image, which is these lines. We'll use that to add some snow around her. So I'm going to go right up to her with that line of snow. This time I'll flip it around, and I'll kind of go under where her legs are bent. Add a little drift of snow there. And then we'll do a little bit over here near her back. There. Actually, while we have that soft suede open, I'm going to go ahead and stamp my sentiment as well. So I'm using the Merry Christmas that comes in the Peaceful Deer stamp set. And I'm only going to stamp Christmas first. I want to do Christmas first because it's the longer of the two words, and I want to make sure that that's going to fit on my circle. So I'm going to, I think you can see that. I think it's on the screen. I'm going to hold my stamp so that it only inks up the word Christmas. So you're going to use the edge of your stamp, and I've done this in a few of my videos. So this is not a new technique. It's one that I use quite often, but it just gives you a little bit more mileage from your stamps because you can change the layout of it. So we have Christmas, and then the key is to remember to wash your stamp, wipe it. I have my Stampin' Chamois right nearby, so I just wipe that off really quickly. Now I'll do the same thing with Mary. I almost wish that I had put that up a little bit further, but that's okay. You know what, I do want to do that. I think I punched another circle or die cut another circle. Usually I have an extra. I know that I had an extra here. I'm just not sure where it went. So I guess we're going with this one. That's okay. I was just going to put the word Christmas up a little bit more, but that'll be okay. I'm still not happy with that. Okay, we're gonna flip that over. I bet you do this too when you stamp something that you're not thrilled with. Do you ever just flip it over and stamp on the other side? We can totally do that. This time I'm going to put Christmas up a little bit higher. I want it more centered from top to bottom when I have both words stamped. That's a little bit better. And now we'll ink up just the word Mary and stamp that above it. And I think that'll be better. That'll make me happier today. Okay. There. Yes, that's better. A little bit better. Okay. We're all done with our soft suede. We're going to come in with soft succulent, believe it or not. We're doing soft succulent for our snowflakes because it coordinates really well with our paper and of course our card base. So we'll set our sentiment aside. We'll bring the deer back in. And I have my snowflakes already mounted. Now, I'm going to ink them up gently, stamp it off one time so that I get a lighter color of, or lighter shade of soft succulent. And that's how I'm going to do my snowflakes around her. Just a couple across the top. It doesn't look green when, or not super green. It looks like a more aqua color, kind of a pool party color, but I really love soft succulent. It's so pretty. Such a nice green. Okay, and we're done with our snow there, and it's time to color our little deer. Now, one thing that I think I've buried here on my surface is my chalk marker. Notice how I added the little white dots with my chalk marker. Let me just grab my bin of Stampin' Blends here. I think I might have I just popped it right in the top of that. Perfect. So we're going to use the Stampin' chalk marker to add some little dots there if you want when we're done coloring. We'll do the same techniques for this deer that we did with the first card. We'll give her some light petal pink on the inside of her ears. And then we'll color the whole deer with light crumb cake. Using those little circles and not using a lot of pressure. We want to make sure that we have a light touch so that we have less ink flowing onto our cardstock. You want to make sure that you're in control of the amount of ink all the time. When you have a really heavy pressure, then more of that ink is going to flow out onto your cardstock. And that's when you get a lot of the bleeding of either the markers or the ink. If you've stamped your image and the ink from the stamp bleeds, often it's because you've used too much of the marker and you've held it in one place too long. There. We'll add just a tiny bit of shading on her. She doesn't need a lot of shading. I'm just going to do a little bit under her chin there. Hi, Judy. Hi, Andrea. I'm just going to refresh this here on my computer so that I can see some of your comments. I'm not sure why I can't see those. I think, okay, I had a different view up here for some reason. There we go. Okay, so last week I didn't have a laptop. So I got a new laptop and it's pretty similar to my old one. There is a bit of a learning curve. So some of the things are slightly different. Overall, it's the same model. I think it's just a different edition. So of course they have to change everything or a few things, just enough to kind of drive you batty. And I'm learning. Oops, going to color on my sample there. So add a little bit of shading there to her leg. See, you can see where I let that dry a little bit. It's going to be kind of tricky to shade that now and make that blend. You might be able to see that, and that's exactly what I told you not to do. I was so busy working on the front leg that I let that little bit dry. I think it'll be okay, but we're just adding a really small amount of that dark crumb cake, just to give it a little bit of shadow there. Okay, now for the part that's going to make it, set it aside, we're going to add a little bit of dots with our chalk marker. And I just think that is so cute on there. Chalk markers, only $3.50 in the catalog, and they can do so many things. It's kind of like a white gel pen. You can add lots of little details. So now we have that stamped image all set. We are ready to start assembling. Let's move this up just a little bit and we'll start assembling our card. So we have our soft, succulent card base. We're going to add our soft suede right on top of that. How many of you are stamping with me today? The other day, last week, we had a lot that were stamping. Some were just watching, but we had a lot that were stamping. So let us know if you're stamping with me today. Maybe hit the heart if you're stamping with us today. I don't see any hearts popping up there. Oh, Debbie's stamping. Good. I'm so glad. All right, so we have our soft suede on there. We're going to go ahead now and add our designer series paper. Now, when we put the designer series paper on, if we match them up in the middle, it should leave an equal border around all four sides. Is Debbie the only one stamping with me? Gail, you must be stamping. You asked me for dimensions or like sneaks earlier today. Are you stamping? Did you grab your supplies? Mary is stamping. There's a heart from Gail. Good. It's always more fun to stamp with friends. Whether you're online or stamping in person, it's always fun with friends. Okay. Gail, I'm slowly stamping too. I am a very slow stamper, I think. Whenever we go to classes or on stage, I rarely make the projects there because I am a slow stamper. I think I'm a slow crafter. Carol's stamping. Okay, so if you don't have this set or the paper, I would really like for you to share what you did with these. Are you just using the layouts? By the way, Carol, your last cards that you shared, those were beautiful. Thank you for sharing those. Gail, I loved yours. Gail, I think used, was it the Christmas Gleaming or Brightly Gleaming paper? I hoarded some of it because I loved it. I loved the copper that was in there. That was from last Christmas. So pretty. I'll have to dig some of that out. Okay, so we have our card base ready. We're going to put our strips on next. So these little 1/4-inch strips of cardstock. The first one is going to go right over that seam. If you are not using two different designer papers, you can use your grid paper to help you or a ruler to help you. You want it to go kind of in the center. But we're going to cover that seam up, so it's okay if it didn't match up perfectly on the edges when you put it down. There's always a little bit of wiggle room there for cutting our designer papers. Now, when we put the next one on, we're just going to leave a small area between the two so that you can really tell that there are three. And I like the way the designer paper poked through there. We did this layout with some florals in one of my Inky Fingers classes. That is a monthly card club that meets here at the studio. And it was so pretty and it was so soft. The colors, we used the hand-penned designer paper. It was just so pretty, but I really like this layout. I cased this layout from Erica Serwin. She did a donkey card with this layout, with the strips going across there during Celebration last year. And it was just so cute. I took a picture of it or a screenshot or something and knew that I wanted to try to recreate it using other products. Okay, so we have our card base done. Now, if you used this punch like I did for the deer, this was the Label Me Lovely punch, we're going to use another punched shape from that, but we're going to cut it in half to make a mat. If you used a layering circle, then you could just use a slightly bigger circle, or you could use a scalloped circle. It would also be cute just to leave it plain. We're going to make a mat though from this. So I'm going to cut it in half, and I'm going to cut it from one of the straight sides to the other straight side. And the way this punch works is that the sides will match up, so we'll have just that little border at the top and a little border at the bottom, but you won't be able to see the gap because the sides are all in line. So we'll just add that with a little bit of liquid glue, and I'll put the liquid glue right on the back of my stamped panel. And now we'll do the bottom. So it just gives a little bit of definition there, so it kind of stands out a little bit. We're not going to put this on our card front yet though. What I'm going to do before that is I'm going to add a little bit of liquid glue to the corner here and just position this so that way I know where to put my dimensionals. I don't want 2 layers of dimensionals on this card, so I'm just going to make this layer first and then center this layer on the front of my card. So I'll use my grid paper to line this side up so that way my sentiment is even. So you can see I've used my vertical line there, and now I can use my grid paper to just kind of make sure that my sentiment is straight as well. There. And so now we have that larger panel that we can work with, and we can center this on our card front. Before I do that, I'm going to add an oversized bow of linen thread, and I'm going to adhere it behind the Merry Christmas. So I'll just tie it while it's still on the roll, making kind of a big loopy bow. I want the loops in the tail to show, but I don't want it to be too big. So I think that's a good size right there. So I'm just going to snip my tail and add this to the back with dimensionals, just like I did before when I used the dimensionals to hold my thread to the back on the first card. I'm going to do that now, and I know that I want it at an angle so that my loops are poking out at an angle, so I can make sure that they are at the angle that I want them to be at by using the dimensionals to hold it down on the back. So now that's how I want my bow to look, a big loopy bow behind the sentiment. I'll add a few more dimensionals and it'll be ready to put onto our card front. That's a good amount. I think that I want the little corner of this to be here above that stripe. That's what I did on my sample card, and I like that look. Okay. Those are a bit curlier than I would like, but it's okay. It'll be okay. There. And of course, you could always add some gemstones on there. Now that I look at it, I think a little bit of Wink of Stella on those snowflakes might be cute. So I didn't do that on my sample, but I think I'm going to add some now. So if you have your Wink of Stella handy, you can add some sparkle to your snowflakes. Ooh, that's a little bit more silvery than I wanted. It'll be okay. There. Here. So we have one silvery snowflake, the rest just are sparkly, which was what I wanted. But now we have our second card finished. We'll set those aside and we'll start in with our last card. So this one has a different background than I've ever used in a class before, and I'm going to show you a couple of variations. So we're making this card that actually doesn't have any deer on it. This is one that you could just use with trees if you happen to have lots of trees in your stamp set, but really the layout would work for any stamp set that you're using. We're going to build a background out of designer paper. Now, you could use just one piece of designer paper. In the directions, I gave you this total. So it was 4 inches wide by 5 1/4. It's one of our typical card layering sizes. However, there are a couple of different variations that you could use to kind of show both sides of the designer paper if you want to. So I'm going to show you a couple of different ways that you can switch that up. Of course, if you want to use just one piece and have that be your card layer, you could do that as well. This is one of my, I think this is my very favorite piece in that entire pack. Oh, and there's my cardstock. That's the one that I was looking for, my extra circle. I knew I had it somewhere. So let's get all of our materials out and then we'll talk about how you can cut this and make that look a little bit different. So we have a card base. Now you could use any size card base any fold that you want for this. It's still a half sheet of cardstock scored, and we'll fold it in half. Now I think for my dimensions, I told you that you would be using the regular size that we've been using, 8 1/2 by 5 1/2, scored in the middle. When I cut my card bases, I did this one a little bit differently. I didn't realize it when I put the dimensions on there. So mine is a tent fold card that opens on the top, but the front of it is the same size that we've been using. So either way would work. And we're just going to fold that to make our regular A2 size card. So you could do either fold on the side or on the top as a tent fold. Now the layers that you're going to use for this are a piece of basic white that is 2 1/2 by 3 1/2, and then a mat that is just slightly larger. So our mat is 2 5/8 by 3 5/8, and that will leave just a really narrow border around all sides of our mat. That's all there is for cardstock and designer paper. Now, if you want to cut this piece, let me show you a couple of tips. So to be able to cut this, we're going to cut it from corner to corner, and you'll need a larger paper trimmer for that. So you'll need one that can accommodate 12 by 12 paper. even though we're just using a small piece. So I'm going to bring in my Stampin' trimmer here. And I'm going to use the track where the blade cuts to guide where I place my paper in here. So I'm going to line this corner right up with the track for the blade and the bottom corner right up. So they'll be opposite corners. We're going to cut it on the diagonal. Be very careful that when you're cutting that these corners don't move. So I'm going to hold it in place, press down the arm of my trimmer, and then I'm going to press down on this clear track so that way I know that it's not going to move when I cut. Now another thing, if your blade is even slightly dull, it could start to tear. So I always, when you're cutting from corner to corner, I suggest moving your blade to the center or somewhere in the middle, pressing down and then working your way to the edges, okay? Or working your way to the corner. That way it's not going to pull and tear your cardstock. So what we have now are two triangles that are exactly the same. Now, if you wanted, you could just use one of these. So let's see, I have a pretty card that we made in another class this week that uses just one of these half pieces. See how it has that half? You could absolutely use just half of this if you wanted to. So you could use the full piece, you could use half, and it would look something like this. So when you have your designer paper there, you would have your matted focal point and it would be on the front like that. So that is one option. You could do the full piece of DSP, you could do the half like this, or you could do the quarters like I'm going to show you now. Isn't that pretty though? That uses the Christmas to Remember phrases, and this is the Christmas season set. I didn't think I was going to love this one, but I really love that set. So that was just one that we did earlier this week. But it used that half. So now I'm going to pretend that this is one piece again. So I'm going to line it right up, match my corners, so that way I have that full rectangle again. Carefully, I'm going to slide it into my trimmer so that the opposite corners are lined up with the cutting track now. Making sure that it's still all in line. And we're going to cut from this corner to this corner. It's even more important this time that you keep your fingers holding it in place and to press down tightly on this clear track. That will hold your paper in place. Again, I'm going to come to the center a little bit so it's not starting on the edge and pulling and tearing my paper, and I will go all the way to the corner, and then I'll come back and go to the other corner. So now let's take these out and I'll reassemble them on the grid paper so that you can see what we have for a shape. So this is what you'll end up with for your cutting pieces. We still have that 4 by 5 1/4 inch piece of DSP. But what we're going to do is we're going to flip 2 of them around. So we're going to take these 2 pieces and I'm going to flip them and flip them over. So now we have our quartered background. And it just gives something a little bit different, just kind of a fun way to show both sides of the designer paper. All right, so now we can go ahead and adhere those to our card front. Now, it's important to keep in mind that you're going to have an 1/8 of an inch border around all sides. You want to make sure that when you're gluing these pieces down that you don't have a space in between. You don't want any gaps at all. If you're not comfortable doing this, you can always take another piece of thin white cardstock or even copy paper and cut it to 4 by 5 1/4 and glue your pieces onto that. If you're not comfortable gluing them down onto your card base, if you're a little unsure if they will line up. But I think that you'll be okay as long as you keep in mind that you're going to need that even border. I would if you're gluing it to your card base, I would suggest putting one of these longer pieces on first, so that way you can have you can see more of that border along that edge. So we'll start with a long side first. I'm using liquid glue, but you can use whatever flat adhesive you'd like. So I'm centering it top to bottom, so I have about 1/8 of an inch on the top and the bottom, but I can also see this long border. So that's why we wanted to start with one of the longer sides. Now we'll work our way around. We're not doing another long one because we don't know exactly what angle to put it at, so we'll work our way around. We'll do our top piece next. And I'm putting it so that that seam lines up perfectly. If it doesn't, if the 4 pieces don't match up in the middle, it's okay. It's okay if there's a little space, or it's okay if they overlap. But we don't want any gaps between the papers. Let's see. I want to make sure I put my adhesive on the right side. Not all designer papers work well with the front and back. This one does. I think this looks really nice together. But sometimes you might have something that is just really wonky and it doesn't look great. And you can always do this technique with 2 different pieces that coordinate. So you might end up having to do 2 different pieces of 4 by 5 1/4. Okay, so now that we have these 2 seams matched up, with this one, it may or may not fit perfectly in there. This one came out really, really close. If it doesn't fit perfectly in there, it's okay to overlap it slightly to make sure that your corners and your sides are completely filled in, okay? This one actually came out really even. Sometimes my gluing is not perfect. So now we have our quartered DSP for our card base. Such a pretty watercolor print. I'll set this aside and we're going to start doing some stamping now. So we're going to stamp our trees and our snow and our bunny on this panel. So add some snowflakes. And I'll show you a little trick for masking the bunny off without having to fussy cut him. So I'll bring in my small piece of basic white. This was 2.5 by 3.5. And I'm going to grab that piece of cardboard too. This is from a paper pumpkin kit. It'll just give us a little bit of a cushion as we stamp. So the first thing that I'm going to stamp is our tree. This is from the Peaceful Deer stamp set, and we're going to ink it up with soft succulent, but you'll notice on my card here that I have a little bit of shading on this side. I did that by sponging some evening evergreen on the side. I like how it has kind of a shadow there, and it looks like there's maybe a spotlight or at least moonlight maybe on the bunny. So let's go ahead and ink up our tree with soft succulent. Now the shading is over here on the left-hand side, but remember that when I stamp my tree, it's the reverse. So I'm actually going to put the shading on the right side of my stamp. That way when we flip it over to stamp it, it will be on the reverse. So I'm just using a little bit of sponge, pressing it right onto my ink pad. So I have some ink there, and I'm going to just shade the side of my tree there. I don't want to go too far into it. Okay. I definitely want to have that definition between the two greens, and you can see that I do there. And we're going to center it from top to bottom. I want to leave room at the bottom for my sentiment. Sometimes with these larger stamps, you don't get the center as clear as you do the outside. So I'm just picking it up and pressing the back with my fingers. And having a good cushion under there can help with that. So you can see now we have that little bit of shading over here, and this ink is still wet, but as it dries, it will start to blend in a little bit. It won't look quite as splotchy there. So that's all I'm using the Evening Evergreen for. I'll go back to my soft succulent now, and actually no, we're gonna stamp our bunny first. So we'll set the soft succulent aside. That's right, we have to stamp our bunny first and mask him off. Quick little masking today. All right, so we'll use Smoky Slate for our bunny, but you could use crumb cake or whatever color you'd like. I want a white bunny, so I'm going to just stamp the outline. So I want him kind of in line with the little snowdrift that's under the tree. Now, this is not typically how I mask. Usually I would stamp on a Post-it note and cut out the image, but I don't want to cut out this whole little bunny, and honestly I don't need to, because the only thing that I need to mask off is the line for the snow, which means I just don't want the snow going across his body. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line the corner of this up so that it covers the bunny, and you'll be able to see like his front paw and his tail, just the edges there. See how it's not actually the white part inside him, it's just that stamped line, the outline. I'm going to put that there and add my snow. All right, I forgot to wash my snow from my deer, so we'll do that quickly and then load up with soft succulent. Okay. So I'm going to stamp so that way it's kind of in line with that tree or the snow under the tree. See how we stamped right over the Post-it note? So now when I take it up, we have the bunny sitting in the snowdrift. And I did that with gray instead of soft succulent. Oops. Let's try that again with some soft succulent. Let's see if I can get it right in the same spot. They look kind of the same when they're both open there. I'm probably not going to get this in just the right spot, but we're going to try it. Yeah, not too bad. Now we'll add a little bit more. I think with this one, I will make it go a little bit closer. We've got a little bit of a halo there where I had to over stamp it. There, and that'll be just fine. Okay, now for our sentiment, we're going to do that with Real Red. And I used It's the Best Time of Year. I liked that it would fit right inside this 2.5 inch wide panel. So we're using that today. That's also from the Peaceful Deer stamp set. I didn't pull in any extra stamps this time. And now we'll do a few more of those soft, succulent snowflakes like we did on the last deer card. We'll use the same technique where we ink it up, stamp off on grid paper, and then add the snowflakes to our card. But I don't want it to seem stripy at all, so I'm going to just kind of change the angle that I stamp my snowflakes at. And it's okay to overstamp your tree. And we're done with our stamping. Let's pull in that linen thread again, and I'll use that same little trick. I'll wrap a little bit around and secure it on the back with dimensionals. Oh, nope, not yet. We're gonna put that on our red panel. Almost got ahead of myself there. So this will go on the red panel first with flat adhesive, and then we'll wrap our twine around it. Now we're ready for our twine. So again, we'll take a small piece and wrap it around right above the sentiment. Make sure that is even before we snip it. We'll add a little bow over here on the side by our tree.